selecting the wrong ERP can cost your company millions. Thank you for joining. Today you will hear about business and technology issues impacting ERP system decision making, recognizing how the business needs have shifted, and forecasting future changes requires a deep understanding of business drivers. On today's webinar, you will learn how to recognize signs that the business needs are outgrowing current solutions, identify the most important factors to include in a needs analysis, how to build an objective framework to evaluate vendors, avoiding mistakes that threaten project success, and ensuring that your technology solution will meet your company's long-term growth needs. As we begin the webinar, we ask that you follow a few basic guidelines. One, to submit questions, please use the questions tab in the panel on the right side of your screen. We will be answering all questions at the end of the presentation. However, please feel free to use the questions tab as questions come to mind. For those of you interested in receiving CP credit for the webinar, please be sure to answer 3 of the 4 polling questions within the presentation, as they will be tracked by our software. An email including the CPE certificate will be sent to all participants who answer the polling questions a few days after the presentation. I will now hand it over to our experts. First, John Yin, who heads up our CIO advisory and ERP solutions practice, and Steve Castell, senior manager of this practice.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining the webinar. This is John Yin. Just a quick intro of myself and Steve as well. I have over 25 years in management consulting and technology consulting. As a partner at Cohn Resnick, I lead our CIO advisory and ERP practice. And my focus and our team's focus is to help companies leverage technology as an enabler to achieve dramatic business value. Steve?
Similar to John, I have 25 years worth of consulting experience with a few years in industry. My expertise is predominantly with ERP systems. I've worked with a good number of them. J.D. Edwards, SAP, some of the Oracle systems. And my specialty has been ERP selection and ERP implementation. John?
Thanks. So, you know, we really want to provide a holistic view of ERP system selections, and system selections, you know, really is kind of the middle piece of the overall project lifecycle for ERP, and we'll talk about that entire lifecycle and framework. You know, we started with saying that selecting the wrong ERP can cost your company millions, and it's really not hyperbole. You know, the right system selected for the right reasons and implementing it the right way can really translate to a multi-million-dollar impact for most organizations. In terms of the agenda topics that we plan to cover today, we'll talk about that overall project life cycle, and a lot of companies and people question, well, how do I plan for it, and what's the right amount of budget to allocate for a project like that. So we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the components of an ERP project and how to plan and budget for it. Importantly, you know, we'll cover some of the common pitfalls of ERP, from starting with an IT strategy and roadmap through the selection process and the implementation itself. You know, clearly we have limited time, so we'll focus more of the attention on the selection process and how to get that right. And then we'll talk about how to plan for a successful implementation, but the details around that will be, you know, saving for a future webinar on implementation success factors. In terms of the life cycle, let's start with something that hopefully, you know, the people on the call can appreciate, a reference to the Blues Brothers. But as you read through this, the real reference is that this is kind of a metaphor for the entire ERP project. In other words, you need to know where you want to get to and why, how to best get there, and your path may be different than someone else's, depending on your priorities, your resources, and your objectives. But you want to make sure you don't get lost along the way and use the right tools and methods to ensure success. in terms of our framework, we view technology strategically with a business-first perspective. And so this graphic represents our framework for determining the requirements and implementing the solution successfully. But we don't do technology for technology's sake, just because it happens to be available. A good example is, in a car that I recently rented. It was a 4-cylinder automatic, just over 170 horsepower. I looked it up, and nothing wrong with that. But it came with paddle shifters behind the steering wheel. So clearly, that's just really to check a box of features as a marketing tool. But if the technology doesn't offer a competitive advantage, then we wouldn't recommend doing it for just the sake of technology. So when we select and implement a new ERP, we start with understanding your business strategy and then making sure that the IT strategy is aligned and can support it. This really summarizes the overall life cycle. As I mentioned, system evaluation and selection is really in the middle. It's what do we do and what system do we select. But before that, we want to make sure that the project is well supported and justified. So oftentimes we start with an IT strategy. And there are different ways to look at whether the investment is justified or not. You can do an IT effectiveness analysis. Maybe it's a risk-driven assessment because you may be on a very outdated system platform and it's no longer supported or well supported. It could be a number of different things. What we'll talk about, and we'll save the implementation discussion for later, we'll talk about some of the business drivers that help support an IT project. So this slide is actually a representation of a framework we've used on other IT strategy and roadmap projects. And what we want to do is understand whatever may be relevant to your situation, but typically would fall into one of these 4 categories. We would want to understand what are the business model changes or changes to the market or your competitive situation, whether the growth is organic, new markets, growth through acquisition, or it's operating efficiencies that we're trying to gain. So I'll describe some of the examples, but what we would want to do is understand what those business drivers are, and then for those set of business drivers in each of those categories, understand what the IT implications might be. So for instance, when we talk about business model changes, a few examples. One company was in a rental-only business, and their legacy systems supported that very well. Then they started to leverage the equipment they were renting to do a lot of work themselves, so it became very labor-intensive, and the systems that they had didn't support that business model. Another company was shifting from a kind of pure make-to-stock environment to a predominantly make-to-order environment. That made job costing and managing margins, a major need, and was an implication in terms of what the systems needed to support. Growth could be from a new channel. In one case, a company was seeing extremely high growth through online sales and leveraging digital marketing. So for something like that, it may not be the ERP platform, but it could be a point solution or some other technology that needs to be selected to support that business model. From a competitive or market challenges perspective, you might be looking at your competitors, and are they using technology more effectively? Do their customers see a difference in the service or product delivery? So that might translate to whether you need to sustain your competitive advantage, or are you looking to leapfrog through the use of technology against your competition. growth, the key thing is when we look at longer-term business strategy and IT strategies, your IT platform scalable. And if the growth is through acquisitions, and that's part of your strategy, how easy is it to integrate the new companies and new products and markets onto your own platform? And when we talk about efficiencies, it's usually about operating efficiencies or process efficiencies. And there's usually a groundswell of complaints if a new system is warranted, or they feel that they've outgrown the existing systems, if there are a lot of redundant efforts, a lot of manual work, or a lot of rework. So what kind of hard cost savings does that translate to? And what are our capabilities, and how do we become more effective? And how can we improve margin by becoming more efficient? So those are all criteria that may be more measurable in addition to the strategic benefits of a new platform. Also, how do we get better information to make more quality decisions? Those are a number of different criteria that resonate with companies that are considering upgrading their ERP or technology platforms. So that brings us to our first CPE question.
So our first CPE question of the day: does your firm have an IT strategy? Choose the most appropriate answer. Give 30 seconds to respond.
Okay, so I think most of the responses are in. Interesting. So about 21% doesn't have an IT strategy. 32% says yes, it covers the next year, and roughly 47%, so almost half, covers 3 years or more, which is really that's excellent. Because you'll see later that having an IT strategy that supports a business strategy takes anywhere from 2 to 5 years. For those that responded for the next year, later on, if you want to shoot a question, I'm just kind of curious if that's more from a budgetary perspective that you're planning for the next year, or it's a kind of a rolling IT strategy in support of your business strategy. But interesting feedback. Thank you. I'll spend a few extra minutes on this slide because I think it's of interest for most people who are considering investing in ERP. Oftentimes the question comes up, even when a selection is being made, what's the total cost of a project like this? And while we're really looking at the percentages, they are pretty representative of how the breakdown of the one-time costs of an ERP would look like. So, but before I jump into the categories, this is representation of, having selected a right-sized solution for your company already. So for instance, you probably wouldn't, select a package like SAP for a $10 million business, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, you wouldn't select QuickBooks for a $1 billion industry. That would be atypical, and typically you wouldn't have those two solutions at the same selection mix. So assuming that we're right-sized in terms of selecting the right package, so that leaves a large space in between those two extremes. What kind of package for what industry and what size business? These ratios tend to hold pretty true. So if it's an accounting-only selection, it may be just for a small or mid-sized company, you might be spending $20,000 for selection assistance, and then the software itself might be $80,000 using these ratios, and the implementation might be around $300,000. And that's for a mid-sized, mostly an accounting system. But if you're looking for full ERP, then the selection might be, say $65,000, software maybe $250,000, and implementation might be $1 million. So full ERP meaning you might have accounting, distribution, and/or some manufacturing in there as well. So the cost obviously could continue to go up, but for a large complex ERP, the software implementation dollars would kind of rise, but the selection costs will probably plateau because the process is still the same. After some point, the level of complexity doesn't influence the selection costs as much. But a lot of absolute dollars would vary based on a number of factors. There's the company size, number of divisions, whether it's global or multinational, locations, user count is a big factor of software costs. The application footprint, number of modules. Most companies, most software vendors will license based on those two variables. And of course, business complexity will have a dramatic influence on implementation costs. So other tips related to planning or budgeting. On the left-hand side, what I described are really the one-time costs, but you should really extend your TCO, or total cost of ownership, to be a 3 or 5 year operating cost, because you might find that you'll need incremental hardware along the way if you're scaling up. Certainly there's going to be an annual software maintenance cost, roughly 20–22% of the license that should be factored in. There may be other third-party software costs. The other thing to consider when comparing TCO is looking at a SaaS, or what's called software as a service, or a cloud-based ERP, because the pricing models are very different from the traditional on-premise costs, and you would be able to see that and compare those more effectively over time. So we talked about some of the drivers of implementation costs in terms of complexity, but also if you are implementing a very large footprint, you may decide to phase the implementation in. So the number of phases and the overall duration will have an influence on the implementation costs. Change management, how complex the change management would need to be in terms of training and adoption, depending on your organization, how distributed your company is, things like that. The degree of integration and data conversion will have an impact on that. Hopefully there are very few gaps that require modifications, but if there are, then that could be a key driver of future costs. And finally, what's in red is avoid the myth of that implementation cost is 1 to 1.5 of license costs. That's usually what is quoted by a lot of software vendors as a rule of thumb, but it's really misleading, because when you license software, oftentimes you can get a discount from anywhere from 10 to 80% of software, but your implementation effort doesn't change with the discount rate. So make sure you really plan accordingly, and like I said, these ratios are probably more representative and more realistic. So we're going to go to another CP question.
So let's stay with the topic of key drivers. What key drivers does your firm use when evaluating new systems? This is a multi-choice select, so please choose all that apply. 30 seconds to answer.
Okay, so I think the results are in. So total cost of ownership is a clear consideration, as would be expected. You know, not just the cost, but what is the return and expected benefits that would help justify that cost. You know, certainly functionality fit is a key criteria. When we talk about our system selection methodologies, Steve will get into, in addition to functionality fit, what are some of the other key criteria to look at when making a decision on new software. Okay, great, thanks. So I'll talk through some of the common pitfalls of ERP projects, and then we'll launch into the system selection methodology. This is really just a graphical representation of how these types of ERP projects tend to go. So it's not a clear success-failure kind of binary result. There's a wide disparity of even implementing the same system at different organizations, how much benefits are derived from that investment. So selecting the right package and implementing it the right way can really help you stay on the right side of that curve so that you are deriving business value. When those things aren't in place, you're actually introducing a new risk to the business and to the company to the point where it can actually jeopardize the longevity of the business. So it's really critical, and that's why we talked about how the impact of an ERP project can cost millions. It's not just the cost of the project, but it's the long tail cost of how well the company is going to be supported with the new system. These are some of the key packages that we work with, and those are the most common ones from the ERP standpoint that's in the marketplace. I think most of you will recognize all these names. The reality is that, you know, if you build it and they will come, that's really usually not a successful formula. You really need to have the business participating in the project itself. Similarly, IT can help drive the project, but we should not look at these projects as an IT project. It's really a business project and it could be transformational for the company. And it's usually not a software problem, which is oftentimes cited that the software doesn't work. You know, when the implementation doesn't go well and the adoption isn't there, a lot of users complain that this wasn't the right software or it doesn't work. And what it really is the way it was implemented, or the change management aspects weren't considered effectively. Because the same system's used by many companies, but the results are very mixed, as we saw in the previous slide. So for a project like this that could span months, if not years, you can understand where there could be a lot of risk in each of the different stages. And, you know, having done dozens of implementations and lots of lessons learned across many industries, different packages, you know, we've compiled some of the key lessons learned and pitfalls to avoid so that we can mitigate risk at each of these stages. At the strategy level, we talked about the importance of having IT strategy aligned with the business strategy, and that the requirements are identified well up front, and that there's a prioritization so that it fits in with your company's resources and capabilities to implement. And as I mentioned before, the time to achieve a business strategy can be 2, 3, or 5 years. It takes about the same amount of time to achieve an IT strategy. So the upfront planning is really critical to succeed in the strategic alignment. In terms of system evaluation, I'll just touch on a few highlights because a lot of it will be covered in the detailed methodology. But one thing I'll call out here is number 4. There's a lot of focus on features and functions, and then when we get into contract negotiations, it's very much focused on software price. And as you saw in the software costs, a lot of it is more on the implementation side, and there's a lot of other things that go into a software contract beyond price, terms and conditions. So some of the legal language, some of the terms and conditions in terms of maintenance and support, additional licenses and modules, those are all just as important as the initial price of the software, because companies have suffered doubling or tripling their software costs over time because of transactions with the company. Change in the name of the company can impact software costs, etc. When we talk about the evaluation methodology, you'll hear about some of the key differentiators in terms of our approach. One is to get an early visualization of the software in a managed way, so that it's not just the vendor coming to do a generic demo, but at the same time we avoid a onerous RFP process, because in today's day and age that's not really very effective in terms of differentiating among different ERP solutions. We also place a lot of emphasis and focus on scenario-based demos. So it's really the use cases based on your business needs that we want the vendors to show how their systems can support effectively. And then we mentioned the selection criteria beyond functionality, which Steve will get into. In terms of the system implementation, again, we'll focus on this in a future webinar, because this in of itself is a very meaty subject. But a couple of things. Number 3, a key pitfall is replicating legacy practices. Certainly in the implementation, that's something we want to avoid. We want to focus on the future state and not fall back on this is how we do it today because this is how we've done it all throughout time. But this has an impact on the selection process as well, because if we're selecting based on requirements that are derived from our current practices, then we're not really focused on what is possible with the new system. So we always want to focus on future state requirements. And then from a post-go live perspective, how ready is the organization from a system perspective, a data perspective, and an organization perspective? And so a lot of this speaks to organizational change management and readiness for a go live, which if we're just focused on these things in the last 3 weeks before a go live, it's too late. So we embed a lot of these activities and focus areas throughout the course of implementation. So we now will transition to understanding, or at least presenting some of our key differentiators in our accelerated system selection methodology.
Thank you, John. I'm going to touch on, this is Steve Castell, and I'm going to touch on the highlights of the system selection methodology that we've developed over many years. We've developed it to reduce the selection time, improve user buy-in, and as John said, to make sure that the process, the systems that's selected is improves the business process. So we're not after just bringing in systems for system's sake, but we're really after bringing in systems that improve the business process of your company, bring you value add and return on investment. There's 2 messages from this slide. This is a cute little joke that I think everyone's probably seen in the industry. We need to make sure we know what we're looking for. We need to make sure that we understand what requirements we're chasing after. The first message here is that it comes from a client we spoke to about 6 months ago, and they weren't quite sure what their requirements were. They weren't quite sure what they really needed. They were looking for ERP because their ERP system was coming up for renewal, was no longer being supported. And we mentioned to them what their plans were after that, and they said, well, we're going to do CRM next year. And my reaction was, you really need to look at what the broad functionality is and the broad picture. A systems plan, a systems assessment isn't a bad thing to do before a system selection, because in that case, with modern systems that tend to cover a very wide, much more than just what we consider ERP, much more than just financials, accounts payable, accounts receivable, shipping, distribution, and manufacturing, they often now cover CRM. They often now cover HR. So I would have looked at both of those systems. Our recommendation was that they look for both of those together so that they'd have as small a footprint as possible to improve, as small a systems footprint as possible, as minimal number of technologies and so on, and rather than looking at the two systems independently. So what I'm trying to say is just because you have a certain footprint now doesn't mean that you should be replacing that footprint one by one. The second message here is that software selection is a very difficult thing to do. Almost anything to do with software is difficult to do. It's not a system where you can just look over. It's not like buying a car. You can look over there and say, wow, that's a very beautiful 4-cylinder, 170 horsepower with paddle shifters, or a nice, Ferrari. You can't point over there and say, I'd like that one, but I'd like it in red instead of in black. You have to describe everything that you're looking for. So it's really key for us to learn how to describe it to us between ourselves, to figure out how to improve the process, to describe it to the consultant, to get the right message to the software vendors, and to get the right message to our management. And some of the things that I hope we'll learn today is how to make sure we're all on the same page and how to then drive towards getting the tire swing rather than some of these other pictures. This is our high-level system selection approach. And as I've said, the goal is to take less time, is to get better results. And something that I think often probably gets missed is to reduce the risk of a failure along the way. Very important to realize that we have to address both moving forward with the system and any risks that might come into play, because it can put a company in jeopardy not to pay attention to the risks and potentially the way to back out from it. The first step in the process is the assessment process, and the real key important step there is to building a project team. And there's really two major compositions of a project team. There's the executive sponsor or sponsors, and they need to support the process going forward. That often means that they support the process as well as to support the process. We're going to be initiating business change as part of this process. And what we want to do is have an executive sponsor that can reach out to anyone that might be in resistance to change and help us to push through those resistance or to handle any emergencies that might, or decisions that might come up that have to be made very quickly. So it needs to be someone who's influential, well-respected, and that will support the project from beginning to end, as I said, monetarily and with his push in the company. The second thing is we need to create a multidimensional project team from within the organization that is predominantly responsible for the selection and then should roll on to the implementation. These are a group of people that understand the current needs of the company, who are typically influential in the company. We like to pick typically super users out of each of the businesses. So we'll pick a accounts receivable super user or order processing super user. But they need to understand the current process, but you also need people that have an open mind, people that can look at new processes, look at the software design processes that are embedded in newer, more streamlined software, or design their own processes. A person who says, I've done accounts payable this way, using paper three-way match, is not the right person. It's someone who can accept the fact that we can now scan in a copy of the invoice, do the three-way match on the computer system, and move right on to payment. The second step in the process is to now define our requirements. One of the key differentiators between our methodology and the typical methodology, and I don't know if many of you have been through this, it was typical to send out a 150-page RFP document. We no longer do that. We are sending out an RFP basically to let the vendors know what the functionality is, the requirements are, and to get an idea of what the pricing is, and we'll come to that a little bit later. But we're really using what we call unique and defining. We're trying to use the 5 or 6 or 7 unique and defining pieces of functionality within your company that are unique to defining your business, the things that make your business run well, and the things that differentiate your business from the competition. In the case of a company that is in financial services, it would be HR and finance. In wholesale distribution, it would be order to cash. And we take that and we develop, as I said, we're going to develop a set of unique and defining requirements. We're going to develop 50 or 100 requirements. We're not going to, we know that today's modern systems can process a journal entry that balances. What we want is to put in the requirements that are differentiate us. So an order process that we can key in internally, or that a user can get on the web and use a web front end to key in his own order or to gauge the order status, are really the types of requirements that we want to have in the documentation. We're then going to turn around and develop 5, 6, 7 use cases. And these use cases are business scenarios that are going to concentrate on the areas, as I said, that differentiate your business. We're going to create the use cases so that they show what differentiates your business and what you need to see in the software to see if the software fits and meets your needs. We're then going to pre-screen vendors. We're going to get down to, we're going to look at the vendors. We're going to, based on vendor experience, what industry the vendors what industries the vendors are successful in, the features and functions that are published for the vendor, the platforms and the pricing of the vendor. And we can pick up the phone. We often at this point will pick up the phone and call the vendor and spend some time with the vendor, asking them questions about specific features and functions. Part of this process is what we call round 1, which is facilitating half-day product walkthroughs. So we'll use our pre-screened questions to get down to 4 to 6 vendors, and then we'll do half-day product demonstrations, product walkthroughs, using our business scenarios, our use cases, to have the vendors show us something for the distribution company, manufacturing make-to-order for the make-to-order company, and go through the processes in order to get ourselves from 5 or 6 vendors down to 2 or 3. Further in the process to get to 2 or 3 vendors, we're going to compile the RFP and we're going to send it out to qualified vendors. This is, as we said, a list of requirements, unique and defining requirements. It's also a method for us to get initial pricing from the vendors and to find out what types of technology platforms they run on. And today, it's a matter of not only the technology platforms that they might run on, but whether they might run the system in a hosted environment, or more importantly, if they run the software in a cloud environment. If you haven't gotten, and of course we're going to run through the typical situation where we'll have the customer respond, let us ask questions, and we'll respond to the questions. If you haven't been able to get down to 2 or 3 vendors from the facilitated half-day sessions, the RFP process should let us get down. The RFP process, the return of the RFP, should get us down to 2 or 3 vendors. We're then going to go in and we're going to take on round 2. With the 2 or 3 vendors that we've come down to, the 2 or 3 finalists, we're going to do full-day scripted demonstrations. That means that we're going to actually go a level deeper than the use cases and tell them exactly what we want to see to get us through to differentiate themselves from the competition. It's very important that they show us everything that we look for, and that we don't allow them to answer to us, oh yes, we can do that. And that's the purpose of creating scripted demonstrations. They're scripted to the level that they show us each feature that we want. They're not scripted to the level that we insist on they're using necessarily our data sets, but we do want to make sure they show us everything that's unique and defining. Subsequent to while we're doing the round 2 demonstrations, we're going to start to agree on our decision-making criteria. And decision-making criteria, as John said earlier, is much more than just features and functions today. Features and functions, of course, is important to what we were trying to accomplish here, that the system runs your business. It has to be a process manufacturing system or have process manufacturing technology, process manufacturing features if you're a process manufacturer. But we're also looking at a lot of other things. Does the degree of fit between your company and this company work? Can you work with them? Are they easy for you to deal with? Can you deal with it? Can you work with the type of people, the type of training that they provide? Is the software easy to use? Can the software be configured easily and changed easily? Some of the more important things we find is vendor viability. You're going to be having this software. The first 5 years goes by very quickly. You want to purchase a piece of software where you know that the vendor is going to be around in 5 or 10 years in order to continue to support the software. You also need to look at the software viability. Does this vendor have 4 different pieces of software, and the piece of software that he's showing you is actually end of life? You need to look at the overhead, the maintenance John talked about earlier, and we need to talk about whether there's cloud options available, because typically today you might want to consider a cloud option now or in the future. We then run through and we move to and we'll facilitate sessions to try to, you take that decision-making criteria, see the vendor demonstrations that we viewed in round 2, and facilitate you making a decision. It's very important that you actually make the decisions. We will try and expedite that process. The follow-through then is selecting the vendor of choice, developing a solution implementation plan, and contract negotiations with the vendor. And we often help with contract negotiations because it's typically a complex set of processes, and as we said, something you're going to live with for some period of time. The plan at this point should include the timeline going forward, the project organization and resources that you're going to need, your change enablement strategy, and what type of risks are going to be involved. Ultimately, we'll present the results to management, and I trust me that when you go to management, they're going to ask you, what's the timeline for the system, what's the total cost of the system going to be, what's my ROI on the system. Some of the system selection criteria, and we've covered some of these things, so I'll run through this pretty quickly, is, as we said, features and functions, the ability of users to accept the system, the ease of integration, and the total cost of ownership. Ease of integration is what I'd like to stop on. Today, systems are much more easy to integrate with. There's tools like EAI tools that allow a system to easily talk to other vendors or to take in data from other systems and almost make them transparent and allow you to have real-time data access between systems. You want to make sure that you're looking at a system that provides that type of capability or plugged into many of the enterprise integration tools that are available, so that you can have real-time data throughout the systems that you own and the systems that you're using. The vendor's product strategy and roadmap, as we said, is very important. Is this a system that has continued to be developed and supported by the vendor? And the vendor fit and the vendor's viability. Well, does the vendor fit with your culture, and is the vendor long-term viable? There's a big difference between a small software vendor that's 40 people and a larger vendor, such as an Oracle or an SAP, that you're pretty sure will be around for the long haul. Developing a business process design is a combination of systems and people. You see the bottom of the slide here, we're representing the typical systems that you probably have in your organization, your ERP system and your CRM system. Up above you see the the requirements, the processes that you need to run from those systems. And today there isn't a hard line between those. There's really what we consider, we're looking for systems that have business rules that define the interaction between the systems. There's a number of reasons for this. It's so that this is constantly definable. The systems process isn't something that you should buy once from an ERP vendor and it only operates the way that you bought it. The business rules should allow you to continue to develop the ERP process, or should I say the order to cash process that your order entry department is using. It should also allow it to be transparent. Your order process could start really with the back-end CRM system. It could end at the shipping system and use the ERP systems in between. The business rules should be able to define from the beginning of the process at CRM through ERP and invoicing and all the way out to shipping. The rules also should allow you to, as you can read down the right-hand side, you're looking to do more than simply process today. You're looking to automate workflows. You're looking to reduce errors. You're looking to monitor business events. And you're actually even looking for systems that can be active as opposed to reactive. A few years ago, systems were considered repositories for data. Now systems are actually active members, can be active members of your team. They'll tell you when someone hasn't bought from you in 2 months. They can tell you when someone hasn't, is due to renew their service or support contract. They really can help you even with selling co-products and byproducts and sell-ons as you go through the sales process. At CohnReznick, we've got a unique innovation lab that we've installed a few months ago, and it's really a new way to go about system design. It's a lab in our New York office, and essentially it's it's a process repository, a beginning place, but it's really a place that we can bring your team and help you to define with our facilitation techniques to build best practices business models. It's a permanent cloud-based business design, and we find it very helpful because the facilitation methodologies will help you to build implementable models, and then the models are permanently stored in the cloud and can be accessed from any place, so that 6 months down the road, when you're looking to see how you design the manufacturing process, we can actually go back and see how the process is supposed to operate by just logging back into the wall, and we can always go back to the sessions and redo and retouch up any processes. It's a phenomenal way to go from start with your old business processes and develop the new streamlined business processes that your company should be implementing.
That brings us to CPU question 3. How does your firm typically select new software? Choose all that apply. We'll give you 30 seconds to respond.
How does your firm typically select new software? Well, we see about half of you review software packages informally and decide. About 57% perform a formal internal selection. I think that it shows that at least the majority of you are looking and using a formal process to select software, and I think that's great. We'd like to see more, obviously, working with people to engage a formal selection. I think there's benefits available, such as experience as to what software can handle, how far you can push a piece of software, how long it can work for you, and the types of business processes that it can eventually handle that might be a bit beneficial. Okay. This slide talks about a number of ways, the ways that we drive a successful project management in a successful implementation project. You can really read the bulk of these yourself. We talked about executive sponsorship. It's very important that we have the proper executive sponsorship to, as we said, to both support the implementation and to make sure you have the proper ability to make changes and the proper funding. Change leadership is very important, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. Quality control is very important. You need to objectively assess the quality of your implementation. You need to make sure that everything is done, that you've tested and tested and tested again. You also need to make sure that you meet any industry-specific quality requirements that your industry may have. If you're in the life science industry, those need to be addressed by the system. We talked briefly about risk mitigation. Risk mitigation is both on the system level. You need to identify any system risks that you need to mitigate and have a mitigation plan for those. And then you need to have enterprise risk identification and mitigation, meaning that as the system goes live, if the system doesn't function correctly, what are we going to do to make the system, to back out the system or to keep the business running in the event that the implementation doesn't go as planned, or that the system doesn't run and support the business as it is planned. Communication and reporting is very important. We need to communicate to our users. And the exception process is something else that I'd like to point out. There should be a defined exception process. When you have a problem in a system, things are handled much quickly when the person has both the authority to make the decisions and you know exactly who to go to resolve problems in the implementation. This organizational change management is an often underlooked part of the system implementation process. Change management, we all know, consists of communication plans where we send out memos to our users and we tell them how the project is going, and it tends to be the first thing that people associate with or put into their implementation plan. But there's a few other aspects that really are important. A training plan we find is very important, and we like to have a super user-led training plan where instead of ourselves doing the training, getting the super users involved makes them very much a part of the implementation process, which then tends to get other users to buy into the implementation to the new software. Business process adoption can be equally important. We need to you should consider doing job impact analysis where we look and see how everyone's job will be impacted and change the job descriptions appropriately so that each person knows what their new job responsibilities are going to be and feels secure in the fact that while their old job may be disappearing, they have a new position. Often what we find is that people shouldn't be processing data 80% of the time. They should be now, your goal is to get people processing data 20% of the time and developing new business ideas or looking at data and analyzing it 80% of the time. And then from this follows an organized transition plan and a knowledge transfer plan so that anyone who's moving from one position to another knows where they're moving from, what their role is after the implementation. This really helps us to keep institutional knowledge inside the institution and not lose staff because we're doing an implementation and they're worried about where they're going to be after the system goes live. And one other thing that's not on the slide is that we really think it's important to get people involved, and it's very beneficial to get people involved, both the super users and regular users, as part of change management with the testing plan. If they're involved with testing, they're actually getting hands-on with the system, using the system, and they'll be able to go back and be much more comfortable with it before they actually go live. It's a great way to get people up to speed and to to build support for the system prior to its cutover. Change management combined with a solid project management office will give you exactly what you're looking for, which is a solidly implemented system and your benefits realized, whether they be in terms of business operations or dollars saved.
All right, folks, this brings us to our fourth and final CPE question of the day. When implementing new technology, what risk poses the greatest threat to your implementation? Choose all that apply. I'll give you 30 seconds to respond.
So when implementing new technology, what risk poses the greatest threat to implementation? It seems that everything on the question proposes a threat to implementation. The largest ones are staff availability and staff acceptance of the new software and processes. I think that that backs up the things that we've been talking about, that executive sponsorship is very important for executive sponsors to allocate the people necessary to implementations and even backfill them if necessary to do their normal jobs, and that staff acceptance of new systems can be very much a problem that you need to address by an organized change management plan as part of your implementation. I'll now turn it back to John to wrap up.
Okay, just last minute or two, just to kind of summarize our key takeaways from the topics covered, especially on the system selection approach. You know, we talked about defining the requirements properly, making sure that they're well aligned between the business strategy and business drivers. You know, conceptualize the high-level future state, focus on system differentiators and not just common features, and translate those requirements into use cases for vendor demos as a way to differentiate them. Secondly, limit the number of vendors to a manageable few. There are dozens and dozens of players out there. We need to quickly filter that down and then use knockout criteria to really down select to a manageable few so we can really focus our attention to those 2 or 3 finalists. Also, we want to seek early visualization of the software and emphasize the use of scripted demos. So avoid generic demos, down select early, and invest the most weight on the scripted demo process. But we also talked about a number of other selection criteria. And use the RFP smartly. We still need an RFP to be able to differentiate and hold accountable to different vendors to compare costs, apples to apples. But let's avoid the list of 1,000 requirements that often just gets checked yes anyway. And then plan for the implementation early. Make sure you backfill to free up your best people for the implementation, and that sometimes takes the longest lead time to do. And then understand and plan for the degree of change management needed, as we just discussed. I think that really hits the 1-hour mark, and we really appreciate all of your attendance. If you have any questions, we didn't get a chance to do Q&A, but please follow up and let us know what questions you might have, and we'll gladly respond to you. And this deck will be provided with our contact information, so you can reach out as you'd like. Thank you for your attention and your participation. Have a great day.